Hi, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about initiations today, and initiations are so critical. Children, typically developing children within their first group of words, start initiating. For example, you'll hear them say "dat," and usually they point to something, and they really want a parent to label things. So that's how they learn and start getting a really big vocabulary. But what we find is children with autism generally have limited functions of language. They're usually use language for two functions only. One is for requests, so they'll ask for things and request things that they want, and protest. So sometimes you'll hear them say no, or don't like it, or go away, or bye-bye. But they're very limited functions. They're not initiating and asking questions like we see really early in language development in typical children. And this kind of got us interested in this whole concept of initiation. So we were doing some studies. Actually, we were moving from one building to another across campus, and we had tapes of the children when they were little, and then they were adolescents and adults. They were really old tapes. So we decided to take a look back and see some of the kids that had really good outcomes, and some of them hadn't had as good outcomes. And we decided to take a look at the tapes and see if there was anything that we had missed. Because in our memories, the children were pretty similar when they were 3 or 4 years old, when they were little tiny kids, and they grew up so differently. So we went and we looked at some of the literature, and we found that there were some predictions in the literature of how children would do. For example, the literature had suggested that children that had the best outcomes had the presence of verbal communication before the age of 5 years and had a measurable IQ above 50. But in our research, we had some children that they were verbal and they had these high IQs, but they didn't have good outcomes, or maybe some of them did, but we really couldn't figure it out. So what we did was we decided to do a study and look and see if we could sort of unravel some of these issues and see if we could figure it out. So we took some videotapes of two groups of children, one group that had really good outcomes. And what I mean by really good outcomes is they had friends, they had sleepovers, they participated in all regular ed classes and did well. After high school, they had jobs or they went to college. Some of them were pretty indistinguishable from their peers. So that was one group that had really good outcomes. But then we had another group of children who, despite the fact that they had verbal communication and relatively high IQs, they didn't have such good outcomes. Some of them were institutionalized, some of them couldn't leave the home, some of them had disruptive behavior. So we really were seeing a really different outcome for these two different groups of children. So what we decided to do was really look at their data and see if we could analyze their very early data. So we looked at a couple of different measures. We looked at communication, we looked at their repetitive behaviors, we looked at their play, we looked at their disruptive behaviors, level of engagement, just about anything you can imagine we looked at. And it was very interesting. What we found was that, as you can see on the bottom row, these are children's language ages in month when they were little preschoolers, little tiny kids, and they're pretty similar. You can see they have language delays. They're maybe 3 or 4, and they have language ages around 24 to 30 months, which means they have verbal communication. They can say some words. They can combine little tiny sentences. So they look like they would have pretty good outcomes, but we looked at them as adults, and we had sort of a normalcy rating scale where we asked people who knew or were familiar with child development to just kind of rate the children and tell us how they looked. And you can see the children in one group came out with very, very high ratings. They looked very appropriate. This child got a 7, a 9, an 8. So some of the kids, people are saying they look great. I don't see anything wrong with them. But then we had this other group, and remember, these are pretty similar kids when they're 3. They're looking pretty similar. But we had this other group that had these really poor outcomes, and people are saying they look very inappropriate. They're getting these really low ratings, 2 and 1 and 3. And this kind of puzzled us a bit. So this is why we decided to look further and see if we could figure it out. So what we found was there was no difference in a lot of the different measures we took. There was no difference in their language test scores. There was no difference in their repetitive behaviors. For the most part, there was no difference in their play. But take a look at this. What we found was the children in the preschool years that had initiations had a lot better long-term outcomes than this second group of children that didn't have initiations. And what I mean by initiations is the children in the more positive outcome group would take things to their parents and show them things, or they might label something or ask the parents a question, and really just had all these initiations. You can see 32 in a short period of time. This child was really going up to the parents and initiating a lot. 21, 16, so they're doing a lot of initiations. And this is in contrast to this poorer outcome group that really weren't initiating. They really just kind of sat there and played by themselves and really weren't too interested in other people. So that was the first study, and knowing that information, how important these initiations might be for long-term outcomes, we decided to do some intervention studies and ask if we could teach initiations to children that weren't initiating, would they have better outcomes also, better long-term outcomes? So we took a second group of children and we started teaching initiations, and we kind of followed a developmental protocol. So the first question, as I mentioned earlier, that comes in typical children is dat. They'll say dat and point to something and the parents label it. So we decided to teach them how to ask the question, dat, what's that? And what we did in our first study was we tried a couple of different techniques, and some of them weren't real effective, mostly because we didn't have any motivational components in. So we combined, there had been a few studies that were published previously where there were no motivational components in the intervention, and the authors commented that while they could teach the individuals to ask questions, whether they were children or adolescents or young adults, they weren't generalizing, and it didn't just become part of their communication to start asking questions. So we thought maybe we could put in some motivational components so the children would really like to ask the questions. So the first thing we did was we got a big brown bag and we put all the children's favorite things in the bags. And then we prompted them to ask, what's that? But when they asked what's that, the important thing is we pulled out something that was really something the kids would like. So that got them that motivation in there to want to ask the question, which you know from the other lectures you've seen, the motivational stuff is so important. So because things were coming out of the bag that they liked, they started asking the questions at a high rate. So they started saying, what's that? And at this point, we really didn't care if the children knew the labels of the items or not. This important point at this point, the important thing was just that they liked asking the question. So once the children were asking the questions at a high rate because they were getting these really fun things coming out of the bag, then we started fading in things they didn't know how to label. So for example, let's say they liked little gummy bears and koosh balls and things like that. They'd say, what's that? We'd say, gummy bear, and give it to them. What's that? Koosh ball, and they'd repeat koosh ball, and then we'd give it to them. They'd say, what's that? And we'd say, M&M, and they'd label it. But then every fourth item, we put something in there that they didn't know how to label. And we did some vocabulary tests, and these were a lot of times very common things that they were exposed to every day but just hadn't learned how to label, like soap and sponge and underwear and things like that they had probably heard the labels a lot, but they weren't really desired items, so they didn't learn how to label them. So then we started fading in these items every fourth, and then when the children still were at a high rate of asking the question, what's that? Then we faded in the items every third, and then every second, and then we faded out the bag so that the children were asking, what's that? About only things that they didn't know how to label. What we found in that first study was through this child initiation, which also generalized to other settings where we didn't teach it, the children learned all of the words that we had targeted and were able to use this initiation in other settings. So they also generalized and learned new targets, and that's really what we wanted. We wanted them to have this strategy for going out in their natural settings and being able to initiate interactions that would lead to learning, such as vocabulary. Then what we did is once we taught the children how to ask what's that, we took some more language samples and we realized that the children weren't really generalizing to other question forms, even though we had taught them the first question, which is what's that? So we started teaching them a number of other questions. And again, we did those in developmental order. So after what's that, the question where is it comes in. And we also use motivational components for teaching where is it. So we'd take some of their favorite items and we'd hide them in locations, and then we'd prompt the children to say, where is it? And we'd say, it's under the sofa, or it's behind my purse, or it's in my pocket, or it's, so we'd be labeling, giving them all these locations of where the items are so that they could learn prepositions through a child initiation. Next, we worked on whose is it, and children with autism often have a lot of trouble reversing the pronoun. So if they'll say pick you up when they really mean pick me up, or you want water when they mean I want water, and it's really confusing because people will say, do you want water? And they'll say, you want water. And they don't understand quite that they have to reverse that to say, I want water. So we taught them the question, whose is it? And before they got this desired item, when they asked whose is it, we would say it's yours, but before they got it, they had to say it's mine, and they had to reverse the pronoun. So that's a way of another child initiation where they can learn how to reverse the pronoun and use proper pronoun usage through a child initiation. We also did it with possessive, so we had families bring in items from different members of the family. For example, mommy's purse, or daddy's pens, or daddy's slippers, or mommy's briefcase, or whatever the item was, and had the children ask, whose is it? And we'd say, it's mommy's, and then they could play with the item. We always try to have some natural reinforcers interspersed in there. We also did some language samples and realized that the children oftentimes in their language use very few verbs. They might use a few like want and go, but they're not using the wide range of verbs that you really need to use to be communicatively competent. So we taught them another child initiation. And to do this, we taught them what's happening, so they could not only learn more verbs, but also learn that ing ending. And we also taught them the past tense to ask what happened. And the way we did this was we got pop-up books that were related to the children's interests. So for example, maybe if they like Thomas the Train or trucks or something, we get pop-up books around that theme. And then we'd manipulate the tab, and we'd keep manipulating it while the children were asking what's happening. And when they said what's happening, we'd say, oh, he's driving, or he's jumping. And you can use all kinds of unusual verbs to just expand the children's verb use, like he's tiptoeing or crawling or slithering or anything you want that will explain what the action is that you're manipulating the tab for. So that was how we taught them how to ask what's happening. And then past tense was similar. We got books, again, of their interests. We manipulated the tabs and then stopped. And then we prompted the children to ask what happened. And when they asked what happened, we said, oh, he drove, or he crashed, or he bumped. And so they can learn those past tense endings. So remember, when you're thinking about this whole concept, we were taking every single language structure that the children were missing, but we weren't teaching it by drilling them through flashcards or something. We're teaching them through a child initiation, so they can initiate in all of their environments and get linguistic information from those initiations. A couple more initiations that we found were really important were look. And the way we taught look was that we'd have the children engage in their favorite activity, or we'd maybe have their favorite item available. And then we'd give them the item, but before they could have it, we'd have them say, look, mommy, or look to the teacher, or look to appear. And then they'd get to have the item. So we're trying to teach them to show and to expand all these different functions of communication. And likewise, help. A lot of times you'll see that children, they'll get really disruptive, and then the teacher will come over, or the parent will come over and say, oh, don't forget, you need to ask for help. And then they'll say help, and then the parent or teacher will help them. But when you think about what they've really learned is that first I have to get disruptive, then somebody will come over, then they'll prompt me to say help, and then I'll get the help. So we've really built up this chain when we do that of starting with inappropriate behavior. So what we found is if we teach the kids to initiate help, You can do this a lot of different ways. For example, get a jar that's a little too tight and put their one item that they really like in it, and then teach them to say help, but prompt it before they get upset and disruptive. It needs to be prompted. So it's just a natural initiation. And then we'll open it up and give them that favorite item. So you can see we have lots of different initiations. We're always teaching lots of initiations so the children have those functions of communication beyond just protests and requests. So let me show you the little bit of the data from our second study. The first study, remember, we just retroactively looked back at our tapes to see why were these kids coming out so differently? Why were some having such great outcomes and such poor outcomes? So with our second group of children, we actually, the language age with this group, you can see, is a teeny tiny bit lower than our first group of children. They're right around the 24, 25-month-old language age, meaning that they have a good verbal vocabulary and they can combine words. But in the next slide, I'm going to show you the difference. Before we did the intervention for initiations, you can see the children have low numbers of initiations, like this child has 14, 6, 1, and 0. And you can also see that this bottom slide is showing their pragmatic ratings, how normal people think they look, how typical people think they look. And you can see when they're doing very few initiations, people say, they don't look very good. People aren't really scoring them as looking very appropriate at all. This child got a 2, meaning very inappropriate. This got a 1. That's about as inappropriate as someone's rating them can be. 2 and 2, so they're getting these really low ratings for how appropriate they look. But look at the difference. This is post-intervention. This is after we've taught them a lot of different initiations. So now they're going from 14 to 46. This child went from just a few initiations, 6 to 27, from 1 to 50, 0 to 25, and look at the difference in their post-evaluation ratings for appropriateness. This child got I think that's an 8, a 7, a 9. This child, people are saying there's nothing wrong with this child, a 6. So you can see that when they're doing these initiations, people are saying they really look pretty typical. They're not really seeing these huge differences in their behavior compared to typical children like we see when they aren't initiating. So just in summary, I'd like to tell you a little bit about summarize our findings. The good news is when we taught the initiations, we saw generalization of the initiation to both home and school, and we taught it our first studies were done in a clinic setting on campus, and they generalized to both home and school. And furthermore, they learned the target behaviors that we were looking at, that we were targeting as a result of the initiation. So if we were targeting vocabulary, they were using that, and all learning that through these child initiations. So you can see that it's really having a positive effect. They also increase the functions of their language. So instead of just using these communication for requests and protests, they're actually using it for seeking information. And these questions are just so important later on for even social conversation. In order to keep a social conversation going, you really need to go back and forth and ask questions, and not just answer questions, but also ask a lot of questions. We also found that their social interactions, as I mentioned, improved. So they're, instead of just waiting for someone to initiate to them, and they are actually initiating with other people. And we also saw decreases in disruptive behavior. As we all know, the more communication children get, the less disruptive behavior they have. But when you think about it, if you couldn't ask any questions, it could be very, very frustrating. So again, just as a whole, what we're trying to do is we're trying to give these children these techniques that they can go out in their natural environments and really learn without the presence of an interventionist, like typical children do. At this point, a lot of the interventions rely all the time on a therapist or a teacher setting up these trials, setting up these opportunities for the children to learn. And what we really want them to do is do some of the learning themselves, to go out there and to initiate these conversations. And we realize this is a pivotal behavior because we're seeing all kinds of positive behaviors and changes in lots of other behaviors when the children have the initiations. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening today, and we have our websites up. Be sure to contact us if you'd like more information. Thank you very much.